Okay, so I actually have a lot of experience about these programs on online higher education being less accessible because my sister, who's a single mom, got forced into doing an online program because she wasn't able to do a traditional program, and because she was a young single mom, and she's seen a lot of the hurts and consequences of these, and I'm going to get into the actual lack of accessibility that this creates. But first I'm going to get into some modeling before I get into my 2 points of main positive matter, which are 1, that this creates a worse education, and 2, that now traditional colleges are less accessible. So getting into some modeling, I think that this motion doesn't require a ton of modeling, but just to give some definitions just so everyone's clear. Higher education programs, we're going to look at this could consist of any bachelor's programs that are online or also master's programs. We're not going to limit this discussion. But we also think that it's pretty clear that we're just arguing on side government, that we believe that the rise or the growth of these online higher education programs have done more harm than good. The weighing mechanism is going to be what's best for the overall success of students. Is this a clarification?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is this limited to online education programs that are only hosted by the university? Does this include things like Khan Academy, other university programs that are sponsored by other companies?
Yeah, great question, thank you. Yeah, we believe that this is going to consist of all online companies, anywhere that you can get a degree. We're not going to talk about the programs that you don't get a degree from, but mainly these ones that you are. So going into my main points of positive matter, how this creates, 1, a worse education. So getting into a little context, these programs are still really expensive, and there's a lot less scholarship that actually is available for these online programs. While they're seen as maybe a great resource, they're still very expensive. You have, and not necessarily accessible right out the get-go. You have to be able to provide things like your own computer, for example. You still have to buy books, and you still are paying for this education, whether it's through a private company or whether it's through if it's through the university. You also, in this, you receive a lot less resources than you would if you went to an established college that is physical and has been established for a long period of time. You have no physical library, you don't have computer labs, you don't have an advisor that you meet with, you don't have the professors, the relationship that you have established. You don't get to have all of these things. You don't get extracurriculars. There's less of an alumni network on these online services, which are less of a gateway for success. We also see that these are often run by private programs, not the state, that are more worried about profit than the actual success of the individual.
Yeah, but this debate has to compare these online programs to actual classical universities. Sure, they're expensive. They're certainly in most cases not as expensive as actually going to the university, and the resources you have to buy do not pale in comparison to the resources needed to access classical education.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely contest on side government that it is less expensive, but while we shouldn't see this as a free route, you're still it's still not as accessible, and like I said, there's less access to scholarships than there would be at a traditional college. So getting into a little bit of what changes when you have these in the growth of these online higher education programs. So students are able to be less involved in the community. Like I said, they don't have the resources that you would at a college. You don't have the alumni meetings. You don't have meeting with your professor. You don't have those resources. A lot of times online education programs don't have advisors for particular programs. For example, every traditional college has an advisor for a Fulbright scholarship, or advisors that help you get these opportunities, advisors career engagement centers. You don't get that in an online education. And the thing is that a lot of people who are from backgrounds that are not traditional are pushed into these online education programs, and because they don't have access to the traditional colleges, and then they are receiving all of these less resources, even though they are still paying a lot. They are expected to provide their own computer, which is an expensive cost. They're expected to buy their own books. They're still expected to pay the tuition of the online school, to pay for their internet every month, and a lot of times these are very expensive as well. While they may not be as expensive as traditional colleges, they're still a huge cost, and you're not getting scholarships for those. So why it matters? In the past, there were night classes. There were all these things that made things more accessible on traditional schools, campuses, but now people are getting pushed into these non-traditional programs, which I'll get into more in my next point. But then after they get these online programs, the degree isn't as recognized. The degree isn't as prestigious, and a lot of times it's harder to get a job in the job market. You don't have the alumni network. You don't have the resources. You don't have like maybe these prestigious awards that you would have been able to access, like a Fulbright scholarship or like maybe like a Truman scholarship at a traditional college, because you didn't have the resources or like the advisors to like help you with these things. We believe that like you're at a competitive disadvantage when you actually go out into the job market, which just kind of, even though you still paid a lot and like you still paid for these things, and that's just like these, we see that these for-profit institutions that like aren't actual universities are often taking advantage of students who don't have access to the traditional experience. So getting into my second point, how now traditional colleges are less accessible. So in the past, like I said, there was night school. There was a lot more night school classes before the rise of this online education and programs. We see that now traditional colleges are using the internet as a scapegoat to strip away a lot of their accessibility programs that like people were able to access through like a lot of different means, which maybe it was night school, maybe it was just like being like disabilities, more disability services, maybe it was like anything, but schools we see are now stripping away from those programs and like putting that money elsewhere because they say, well, they can just get an online education. But as I've proven to you, that online education isn't as thorough. And so what we see happening, we see that like now non-traditional students are less able to receive the great education that comes with traditional colleges. We see that like they are having less access overall, and this perpetuates the standard of like people who are in non-traditional situations to not be able to achieve the educational success that people who were in traditional traditional systems, traditional situations are. They, like, these people get treated as less than, they don't get access to as good of an education because those programs aren't available to them. We see that like overall we see that like the growth of online education or online higher education programs has done more harm than good because it like it like makes it so that these people have to do online education programs which are inherently not as good as traditional colleges. Thank you.
I think the Prime Minister for their speech got called upon the leader of the opposition, open up the opposition bench. You're here. Where's the pink dress?
I have one for tomorrow, I promise.
Okay. I won't be here. So.
Lame.
Many people live in rural Alaska, and they don't have access to traditional ways that you would actually get to a physical university. Most of these communities are not even on the road system, and we think it's important to understand whenever we talk about access that we're not just talking about the access for people who have to choose if they live in Seattle, if they take an online university, or if they go to Seattle University, but instead of talking about what happens whenever people who literally would not be able to have access to these places are not allowed to have access. First, into clarifications and contextualizing what we hear out of government's side, and then talking about my 2 points of constructive access matter, which talks about how online education equals access, and then secondly talking about how online education improves all tertiary education. First, into clarifying and contextualizing the debate. We think the framework for this debate needs to talk about what the purpose of universities are and whether online education upholds or degrades that purpose. We think, on our side of the house, that the purpose of a university is twofold. First, we think it is about education and specialization. It's about allowing people to be able to specialize in their field and be able to be more successful in their careers in the future. But secondly, we think that universities are about providing access to that education and specialization. We think that if it was not about providing access, we wouldn't see universities offering things like scholarships to students in the first place. But secondly, it's important to talk about what the value of a degree is in 2019. We think that the traditional value, the classical value of a degree, has gone away because now most jobs require you to have an associate's or a bachelor's degree. It is treated the same way that we've historically treated high school diplomas, in that it is something that is now an expectation for you to have. We think, but secondly, we think it's important to also understand what we think student bodies currently look like. We are talking about 2019, in which the majority of students are non-traditional students. We think these mean people who are not living on campus, who are commuting to campus, who have their own lives, who have children and families, and are trying to work at the same time. We think it's also important to understand that statistics show that these people are not interested in traditional campus communities because they no longer need to have that community because they have their own lives off of campus. Whenever you look at the numbers of students engaged in things like student government or sororities and fraternities in campuses, those numbers have been declining because people are no longer interested in that kind of engagement. They view university as a place to learn and then leave. First, into online education and how it equals access. First, traditional education only accommodates traditional students, and this is the most important part that we think we're going to bring you on the opposition. We think that you have to do things like physically drive and show up to that school, right? Like you have to make time, you have to sacrifice the amount of shifts that you can work, you have to sacrifice time that you could otherwise be spending in your life that you have because you're a non-traditional student. We think that what this does is that universities exclude commuter students by saying that you're not taking your university serious enough and that essentially you're not engaged enough with your campus. This ostracization is real and it happens. But secondly, we think it's important to understand what kind of access we think is unique to online education that you cannot get at a traditional school. First, we think it is simply cheaper. And the Prime Minister says, but you still have to buy books and you still have to buy a computer. You have to buy that anyways if you're attending any kind of university education. But secondly, we think it's important to understand that you don't have to build and maintain building infrastructure. You don't have to do campus landscaping whenever you don't have a physical campus. We think what this means is that inherently these colleges end up being cheaper because they simply occupy less space and it takes less time and money to run them. But secondly, we think it allows for students to study on their own time, to take tests on their own time, because there is not an expectation of attendance. That means that I can do my homework at like 11:59 p.m., right? Instead of having to go and show up at 9 a.m. whenever I have work at the time, right? We think what this allows is for students to better cater their education to their lifestyle and not telling them that they have to sacrifice their lifestyle in order to get an education. We think this is the reason why online university tends to be so appealing to students, and the reason why it is so pervasive in our society is because it says, look, we're not making you make these different compromises, we're telling you that you can have both. Third, we think that it allows for less fear of professors and more engagement with the other students in your class, because you don't have to be worried about asking someone something, because it is all essentially like faceless, right? What this means is that I don't have to see my professor look at me really disappointedly whenever I ask them for a third extension on a paper. It means that I can just email them and I don't have to deal with that personal shame, right? Lastly, we think that this is the gateway to better education. You can get your requirement classes out of the way and not have to spend a ridiculous amount of money. This is how we allow students who do want to do a more traditional academic route to be able to access that in a way that they might not otherwise be able to. Okay, second, online education improves all tertiary education. I'll take a POI if anyone has one.
I think you sort of mentioned this point of like it's cheaper because it takes up less space, but like what about online programs through traditional universities that use all the money they get from online universities abusively and pour it into their students like that are always on campus anyway?
So I'm going to talk about that a little bit in my second point here of how we think that online universities and like online education and even just online classes from traditional universities help strengthen all tertiary education by providing competition. First, we think that online education provides competition to the traditional idea of an ivory tower. We think that universities are broke. They are shuttering everywhere because students are less interested in going to traditional universities. And so this forces traditional universities to start to make compromises about what is best for their student body. We think that what this looks like is traditional schools offering more amenities to non-traditional students to win them over to get their money, right? What this means is that you see things like universities that previously would never ever offer an online class or would never ever have like their professors like film themselves and put it out on the internet for students to be able to study. You now see these universities doing that because they understand that the trade-off in why people are choosing non-traditional online schools over traditional schools is because they want that kind of access with their professors. We think this means more flexible schedules. We think this means offering more kinds of scholarships to these students to try and get them into their university. For online schools, we think that what this means is that they're offering more options to win over these traditional students, right? We think this means things like online counseling programs in which they say, look, we can have a therapist talk to you the same way you would have a college therapist at a traditional campus, but now we can do it over Skype or we can do it on a chat system. What this means is having student groups that are physical, that they say, hey, look, there's 10 other people in your place that are also attending this university. Now you can have this kind of physical engagement if that's what you really want. You can have online advisors, which previously you would not have access to, but now you can have access to it whether you go to an online university or a traditional one. We are not going to say our opposition that traditional schools or online education is absolutely perfect, but we think the only way in which we get a university system in our country that is cohesive and is accessible to all kinds of students is whenever you have this competition between online and traditional universities. Proud to oppose.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition for their speech. Now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister if the top half of government space here.
So on opening government, we think that the key issue with the opposition case is that a lot of the accessibility issues that they address, such as commuters, such as like lifestyle and like working around schedules, that those things were more available in an era under which online education wasn't a scapegoat for colleges in order to strip away the resources that they had. We think that in the past, when they had satellite programs and buses that used to go pick students up from to go to UW from over an hour away for free, that the rise of online programs makes those resources disappear and puts these people at a competitive disadvantage, and particularly harms the people who still have to go to traditional schools because of their resource accessibility. So refutation, then I'm going to get back into our own case and address a point of positive matter about the change in standard in who needs degrees. So first onto refutation, their first point about access. The issue with like the idea of commuter students. The issue is that resources such as satellite programs disappear. These people are getting a worse education for the same amount of money, and it hurts the people who have to go to normal colleges because normal colleges offer them scholarships. When we talk to you about this being cheaper, the fact of the matter is that for people in need, these programs are more expensive because there is no such thing as a free ride to an online university. There is no such thing as a free ride to Phoenix University, which is a for-profit corporation. We tell you that like even if you get an online accessible program towards like somewhere like UW, that your resources are stripped, that you aren't given as much scholarship, that things like summer programs for traditional schooling like SeattleU, you don't get, as a commuter student, you don't get any scholarship applied. This is why there is a cost-benefit analysis here that goes ignored under the lens of scholarships. Secondly, on the idea of like lifestyle and like facelessness, we tell you that the idea of like facelessness and like that you can be more brave and you can ask for however many extensions you want, like would be great, except for that you've decreased, and what they point out is that you've decreased the student accountability in their education, that people are more willing to take these kind of risks that like put them at a competitive disadvantage, that disengage them from the education that they're receiving, that they're getting a worse off education. Additionally, on the idea, their second point about this is all better because of competition, we think that this would hold true if people saw online degrees as equal to a traditional college. We tell you that there is a clear hierarchy in the hiring practices that exist, and that those are translated into people who are going to colleges like Phoenix University or like Washington Government University, that like these are seen as less positive, that they aren't getting the same amount of jobs, and that they've had to pay through the nose to get to pay for them. Go for it.
Yeah, a lot of jobs right now just want you to have a bachelor's degree or associate's degree. They literally do not care where you got it from because they're seeing it as a prerequisite similar to high school.
So we actually think that the reason that is because like the reason that the expectation has been placed on everyone that they should need to get a bachelor's, they need to get a master's degree, is because they have these online programs that say you can get it easily, you can get it in 2 years, that the accessibility of that has increased, but I'll get into that more later. So back into our own case on the idea of this being a worse education and it harms the success of the students. Again, we tell you that like the lack of scholarships puts this at a cost disadvantage. What are the impacts of these types of things? Firstly, with the idea of less engagement, the less contact with professors, we think that makes you less engaged in your education. Secondly, that the lack of community. We think that these are really common programs for computer science folks who aren't getting engaged in things like necessary communication skills and team building that would come from a direct in-person traditional college program. Thirdly, that the expenses given scholarships and given like the lack of resources, the lack of like computer labs, the lack of library access, that these things are harmful. And fourthly, that you're being placed on a competitive disadvantage to normal degree. When we decrease the amount of resources that these students have access for, when we use this as a band-aid for the actual problems at hand, when we decrease the quality of the degree and this decrease the quality of education that you have received, we think that this hurts people who are forced into these programs, or for people who see these as an easier program to access. Secondly, on the idea that this produces less accessible average colleges. We tell you that before the rise of these programs, things like night school were very common for all types of degrees. Things like that over time, as these online higher education programs have increased in popularity, that accessibility programs like allocation of really late office hours, like stipends for free childcare, have gone into decline. Things like transportation that goes very far into other communities in order to help people get access to college has increasingly gone down. We tell you this is for a very specific reason. It's because colleges and no longer see this as their niche. When like Phoenix University goes and markets their online programs as colleges for single mothers, colleges who commonly went out of their way to give resources now don't see a need due to their strategic marketing plan that happens. That if they don't have to provide for it and they don't have to pay for out-of-pocket childcare, that they were able to stop it. When a company comes out and says that we provide a college program that's marketed for you, that the colleges no longer felt the need to do this. We think this hurts people who who feel as though entering one of these programs will be better for them because it isn't as good of an education and it is equally, if not more, expensive. And comparatively, we think that this hurts people who need to go into traditional college programs because they don't have the resources needed to help them in terms of access. Okay, what happens to the change of standard? As we've kind of all talked about at this point, like the status quo has been like that, or like in the past, the expectation for most jobs was like just a high school degree or like an associate's degree. Like as college became increasingly more accessible, that the expectation increased, like it was a norm for people to have college degrees. We think that the rise, however, of online education programs has only accelerated this into a dangerous place. We tell you that like at the point at which elementary school teachers are being asked to have a master's degree in order to, get a job that doesn't pay them enough money to get a master's degree, that there's been harms that have been enacted on these people, that things that don't require as much, technical education need more and more degrees. Higher and higher education gets pushed due to the normalization of these like accessible online higher education programs. We tell you that the burden of entry into these programs is very high in terms of accessibility, in terms of money that you need in order to enter them, but that it hurts people who wouldn't be able to get into these anyway. The point at which people who used to not require, master's degrees to have and work in their field, that the expectation has risen, and that now they have to take out the time in order to enter into these programs, and they have to pay for it. At the end of the day, opening government points out to you that the quality of education for these students is less, their standing in the competitive job market is less, but furthermore, that this hurts the people who are in traditional programs, that the people who relied on resources to be in a traditional program that provided them with scholarships has gone down, that their accessibility and transportation and childcare in late and night classes has gone down, and that the change in standard of education has increased proud to times.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech. Now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close off the top half of the opposition's case.
So at the end of the opening government case, I'm probably willing to concede that online education has done a small amount of harm. The problem is today's debate is about whether or not it's done more harm than it has done good. And I think the fact that there might be less scholarship or less bus systems that take people from an hour away to UW does not compare to the fact that we just give a vast, immense amount of individuals access to an education that, while not make them as competitive on the job market, makes them comparatively far more competitive on the job market and far more beneficial to their communities than they have been before. I'm going to just do comparative in today's debate, tell you why the good vastly outweighs the harm term, and I'm going to do it on 3 facets. First on accessibility, secondly on opportunity, and thirdly on quality. Let's jump right into accessibility then. Opening government first tells us that it's still expensive and there's less resources. Like, the basic response to this is like, I don't care if it's expensive, it's vastly cheaper than the at-campus alternatives, where you're not only paying for resources like libraries and things like that, but you're also paying pretty obnoxiously high on-campus living costs that are usually higher than the living around that area, and they force you to live there typically your freshman and sophomore year. It's like, look, the reason you don't have things like libraries that they think are so important is because you're not paying for them anymore. It's not like you're getting this great free resource when you go to an on-campus education. You're just paying more to get that resource. I think individuals should be able to make the autonomous decision to get their cheaper education and say, I don't care about a library. I probably have a public library in my small town, and I can get what I need there. The second thing that opening government tells us is like, night school gives the same access but better. Like, firstly, I want to emphasize Hayley's response to this about like most rural communities, not only in Alaska, but in a lot of places in America and other countries, don't have access to this kind of night school education, right? But I want to emphasize how important this is to rural communities here and give you a little bit more information on the deputy leader of opposition. When individuals from rural communities that don't have the access to get out of that community but can get educated in that community, they actually improve those communities immensely. Right now it's really hard to get teachers to go fly into rural communities because they don't want to live that lifestyle. With online education, you can home grow teachers within a rural community and make that rural community vastly better for all the participants in it. This access is incredible and can't be understated. But the second thing is, it's like single moms can't really go to night school. I don't care if you give them a bus from an hour away, they still have to work to pay and feed their families, and then they have to go home and take care of their children because daycare doesn't go past 6 o'clock. The bus doesn't solve on that in that instance. But like, I want to respond again to this like buses and satellite campus solvency that they try to give against our case. And I think it also doesn't weigh against Hayley's impacts about how face-to-face education can be brutal for some students. For some students, like the example of like feeling ashamed when talking to your professor isn't actually the best example. The best example is there's a lot of tenured professors that are actually old and racist and sexist and do not take into account the opinions of women and people of color as much as they take into account of the opinions of white men. These people are able to go under the veil of online education and get better access to resources from their professors than on the comparative. Secondly, on opportunity. First thing opening government tells us is that there's like no scholarships for online school. Look, this just isn't true. Like, if you go to online school through Southern New Hampshire University, for example, you're going under the same financial aid umbrella that exists. You're still able to do FAFSA if you go to online school, for example. They want to tell us like the only online school that exists is the for-profit University of Phoenix. That's just ridiculous. There's other online schools that you can access that have financial aid opportunities for people who don't make enough money. The second thing opening government tells us is like, you can't apply for the Fulbright if you go to online school. This is just a ridiculous comparative to have in this debate. Most of the individuals that we're talking about increasing access wouldn't be able to apply for the Fulbright anyway because of the structural disadvantages that they have. Okay, the last thing, an important here in opportunity, I want to weigh against opening government's claim that you can't get jobs as easily from online school. A couple things to say. Like, one, we're going to concede that you're not a Harvard Fulbright scholar if you go to online school. It's like, that's not the comparative in this debate. The comparative isn't between the online school person and the guy that got a really like pretentious Ivy League degree. The comparative is between like UAA and Southern New Hampshire University, which like honestly, me going on campus at UAA hasn't benefited me that much over someone who gets a BA from Southern New Hampshire. It's not like an employer's gonna be like, that degree was online. Like UAA isn't respected either, and a lot of state schools and community colleges that these individuals would be going to anyway aren't respected. We think you still get that same job access when Hayley tells you, for a lot of jobs now, it's just have an associate's degree, have a bachelor's degree to be competent. Well, the fourth thing I want to say here, and this is an important weighing against the Deputy Prime Minister, I think you might actually be able to access some jobs better from online school. Why is this? Because some people can't get jobs easy out of education because people look at them as someone who's been spending the last 4 years of their life just partying at a college. When you go to online school, you can get on-the-job training and get your education at the same time. For example, if you go to an online Master of Library Science, you can work within a library, and then when you go to apply for a job, you have both your degree and your job training, on-the-job training and job experience. We think as experience becomes more and more important for employers, the ability to work while you're going to school that online education provides is incredibly important for giving people access to jobs. Thirdly, on quality. Okay, the first thing I want to say here is face-to-face education isn't that great, and there's two reasons for this. The first reason is that like most universities go under a publish or perish ideology, most universities that these individuals will be going to, and professors aren't that interested in teaching their students because it doesn't give them that much benefit. And honestly, most professors just aren't great lecturers anyway. I'm not going to say like, look, at UAA I've had a few great lecturers, but most of them have been incredibly boring. I've gone into stuffy classrooms with like 70 plus people, and I've listened to a lecturer drone on that has no interest in teaching me because they just want to publish their next paper. On the comparative, we think online education can actually be quite cool because instead of like sticking to this antiquated lecture model, they actually create multimedia presentations that make education better in some respects.
Okay, so like shitty professors are the people who are making this content. I don't think that you actually generate any kind of shift. It's just less qualified or less respected professors that make it.
Okay, two things to say. One, shitty professors aren't making this content because they can't be bothered to make to go online and computer program a classroom. We think it's individuals who have like multimedia training that want to create combinations of videos and text that can actually help individuals learn. But secondly, like even if you buy this POI, Judge, it's like that's just a wash then. You get crappy professors in both worlds. We still get the better access and the better job opportunities that we're talking about. And the second thing I want to say is like most students don't have access to their professors because universities that like poorer people have access to are incredibly large and have large amounts of students. So like and professors don't have office hours for that long. So it's not like you're getting better access. But the last thing I want to talk about is mental health. There's an incredible amount of individuals that go off to university and they have bad mental health problems, and universities have to invest a ton in mental health resources because of this. And the reason for this is you cut yourself off from your communities that help you when you go away for education. But if you can stay in your community and continue to have those kind of resources while you're getting an education, you don't get those bad access. And the last thing I want to say, panel, think about this numerically. We get so many people access, and that's such a good thing. Very, very proud.
Here.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition for their speech, now call upon the Member of Government to open up the back of the
Every time John speaks, I'm just like, yeah. Except like this time I have to be like, no. Because John tells you a few things. First, that we increase accessibility, and we should vote on that. That we have like high opportunity, we should vote on that. And finally, that we this is good quality education, and we should vote on that. We agree with a few things from our opposition that perhaps there's not been a huge comparative or burden of weighing, and we're willing to see that some things about education online are good, because that just seems reasonable. What we're going to show you is that perhaps these harms and mitigations and benefits aren't that great, and we're going to show you a comparative at the end, just give you reasons, standards, and preferences to weigh why the harms matter more. A few things to reputation. On accessibility, we think that traditional cobblestone colleges don't go away, and that currently online education has been used as a tool to make sure that these Ivy League schools get to keep revamping up things like tuition, because they get to add in things like new amenities, etc. We get some analysis coming from our top half about why this might be true, but we think that accessibility for colleges is cool, it's alright. It means that perhaps colleges become more expensive now on campus as a result of online schools, but we'll weigh that at the end. We think that also the reason that these schools are so cheap is because they abuse adjuncts and affiliates in teaching positions who are forced to create curriculums with little to no experience and training that they don't have the time equipped for, or the resources from department heads to back them. Also, on opportunity, we think the opportunity is sure, there might be some scholarships for online education. Here's why these are more likely to go to on-campus students. Because students that are on campus for things like sports or debate are able to bring more revenue and activity and attention to the schools. There is little to no incentive for an individual to get a scholarship for an online education besides things like federal grants, which means that you have little to no access to the vast plethora of scholarships inside of the house. It's cheaper and more expensive because you abuse affiliates and adjuncts. We'll tell you all also why it's not that cheap and still abuses some people. On quality, we think that this is actually a matter of research versus teaching schools, right? R1 schools all have more tenured faculty, and they want to research and they want to publish or bust, right? This means that more online education is coming from more research schools, where you have more adjuncts and affiliates who are less equipped, because John's right, you can't bother the tenured professors to filter online classes, so you get shittier quality faculty administering online courses that department heads and resources don't actually care about.
On that.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
easy comparative, adjuncts are slaves to university systems at traditional schools too. That's why they teach like 5 class loads of one-on-one classes with a bunch of shitty freshmen, and the other tenured professors get to do the cool stuff. Why is that more likely to happen on your side of the house? Like again, a comparative debate, for God's sakes.
Insofar as John's analysis is we reach more people, vote on us on UTEL, cross-apply the UTEL impact to say that you harm more people, because the adjuncts are always going to mean that you need more of them to filter out more students. If you want that comparative, we win right there. It doesn't matter. Cool. All right. Haley tells us that there needs to be an idea of a university and that it has specific obligations to specific shareholders. We think that the university does have obligations, and Haley's right, but they extend beyond the classroom or the laptop, and that the university acts as a beacon with infrastructure that deeply impacts its local community and local surroundings. We're going to win on that comparative. First point of positive matter, targeted algorithms. Here's how this works. There's a company right now, a corporation called LearnQuest. This is a company that works with other similar companies to compete for bids to market out how advertisements hit individuals to attend for-profit or online institutions that are not for-profit. It's a good strategy because it targets individuals that meet a list of 3 criteria. 1, individuals that recently take out payday loans, which have a 10% interest rate, which means that the APRs are around 400%. Second, they target individuals that are close but no degree dropouts, individuals that have had to leave for reasons like single motherhood, family debt, financial burdens, or etc. And finally, they target individuals that are geographically isolated from democratic or bureaucratic institutions. This is the analysis that you get from the government. Here's why this is bad. This means that these algorithms are predatory, that they seek out individuals that they know are going to get stuck in loans, even if tuition is $15,000. If you are a low-income citizen, that is $15,000 that you are still taking out loans with high APRs for. For-profit institutions and online educations, even though not for-profit, use targeted algorithms to find specific individuals that they know can act as money feeds or vehicles into institutions. Here's why. Online education is a vehicle so that Ivy Leagues and research schools can get more money into the departments that they think actually matters by screwing over individuals with lower quality degrees from abused adjuncts and affiliates that are predatory where they're still taking out loans. This means that the ads for things like Facebook and social media that we already hear about because of Russian corruption get worse and are the vehicle for things like institutions like targeting individuals. The case study right now is the University of New Mexico, which has recently been targeting individuals all over New Mexico that they know come from low-income neighborhoods, specifically in areas like Albuquerque. Second point of positive matter, this harms the development of the academic infrastructure in the global south. Take the case of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, which decided that in 2016 to launch a huge campaign to reach out to people in India to go to their school, saying our school is cheaper, American education, whatever. Here's what happens. You target individuals in the global south with the narrative and idea of an American education. Cross-apply all the analysis about why the American education isn't even that great for those who are in America being abused by the system. What happens then is you see massive drain of individuals from India or the global south who are flocking to these online education institutions, and here is the warrant, here's the impact. It destroys the necessity to create critical academic infrastructure in those areas. We have seen that the University of New Delhi has seen a significant dropout rate or decrease in enrollment in the last 7 years. The primary reason for this has been that online education institutions are able to target developing nations in the global south and rip those nations of the necessity to create their own grassroots academic infrastructure. This is a huge terminal impact. Universities are necessary for medical research in areas. The University of Michigan Flint was responsible for breaking out the Flint water crisis. Universities provide the critical infrastructure necessary to back injustice and to combat things. They're also necessary for civics, cross-apply all impacts that they garner off of civic engagement and democracies. Universities have an intrinsic tie to increasing civic engagement, civic knowledge, and literacy about bureaucratic institutions. Third impact here, social justice. Universities are key to combating human rights complexes and increasing literacy around group mobilization and grassroots structures. Whenever we rip developing nations of the ability to have their own critical academic infrastructure, we harm these nations as a whole. The American online university has been disproportionately targeting America's most vulnerable citizens and the global south's most vulnerable populations, ripping developing nations of their rights to create their own academic infrastructure and furthering harming adjuncts and affiliates and all those involved in the process. Here's the comparative. We think that yes, this is good, but all impacts are bigger and more terminal and they affect more vulnerable populations.
I'll take a member of the government for their speech, and I'll call upon the member of the opposition to open up the back half of opposition's case here.
understandably, the vast majority of this debate up until Nick's speech, and even though mostly, have been focused on accessibility for people who can't get access to college education. And I think that's fair. That's the vast majority of what these debates tend to be about. But there's a population of students who have the means to get to school. There's a population who have been trying to enjoy an education for several years. We want to talk about how the experience for the vast majority of individuals who go to college, specifically people like people with neurotypical disorders and mental disorders, people like me who have crippling ADHD and literally can't enjoy a traditional college experience, and why it is shitty for them. We're going to make it the largest impact of the debate, and then we're going to shut the government bench out. It's going to be on sweep. Deconstruction is going to be interwoven, of course. First of all, let's talk about the one-size-fits-all model, and then second of all, let's address the CG extension and talk about solvency. So, on the one-size-fits-all model, I think there are 4 different elements of the in-class model of education that are absolutely horrible, right? The first is lecture styles. And opening opposition spent 15 seconds on this and talked about how professors talk over people, but I think this is a lot more dramatic. For people with ADHD who literally cannot pay attention for longer than 15 seconds, lose out on important material, fail tests, they fail their classes, they try to ask for help from other people, but it's simply not enough. They take a lot longer to learn those sorts of things. People who prefer auditory or visual learning are shut out of lectures because professors take too long rambling about how they got their PhD and then putting the cool new book that they just wrote because they've got tenure and they don't give a shit about their students. People with neurotypical learning disorders are literally unable to access those sorts of education. Second of all, the Socratic method of teaching is awful for 2 kinds of people. First of all, the kinds of individuals with anxiety and don't want to speak up and talk around other people around them because they don't want to be judged by their social peers. Opening opposition also talked about women. They talked about how professors talk over them. We think that for the vast majority of individuals, it's really hard to be able to actually speak up and get a single word out. That's not a neurotypical disorder. We're just adding something and developing something a little bit more. Third, it is routine based, right? So disorders like bipolar disorder, who are very, very prone to not being able to adapt to routine-based learning, that is going to consistent classes because there are a lot of mood developments that you need to account for via your own self-care, are literally unable to go to class, have to skip class at certain times because they know they're not going to be able to accommodate and pay attention. Mothers, working individuals, people who are more susceptible to inequality as a result of rising housing prices and rising food costs are literally unable to attend these classes. Let's also talk about an environment where college is becoming increasingly expensive and people are having to take out way higher loans to be able to actually afford college. These people are also shut out. Fourth, in-person tests, right? People just fail tests, even though they're probably the smartest person in class, because they're so anxious that they literally can't fill out the bubbles on their paper without freaking out, having to take a second time, ask the professor to retake the test, and then failing the class. The impact of this is pretty easy, right? They tell you that we need the traditional experience, right? The problem is that the vast majority of people who are getting it resent the traditional experience because it made their life hell for 4.5 to 5 years. It made their life hell for the last 4.5 to 5 years, and it meant absolutely nothing to them. But moreover, as a result of failing classes, it means that you have to retake them, spend more money, take out more loans to stay in school longer, which means if we're doing this whole dumb cost-benefit analysis thing that happened in the top half, I think opening opposition's right. It's a hell of a lot more expensive because even though if we're going to just take their argument the absolute best, which isn't really an argument, it's just way too many assertions, even if 4 years of traditional versus online school is cheaper for traditional schools, that assumes that you actually take the time to fill out and complete school in the allotted period of time, which most people do not. Why is that? First thing we like to say, of course, on top of the impacts that we just gave, there are a lot more people being diagnosed with the kind of disorders that can't adapt to the traditional learning style, which means there are more people who are taking out more loans because they literally can't finish classes. Then we get the stuff about how the traditional experience is so important and you need these alumni networks and you need all these very, very special things. 2 responses. The first thing to say here, and this might be it's really important that this is being introduced into the debate, I'd say that the vast majority of experience they're talking about is not unique to school. You can go to a job and get experiences and connections with other individuals. You can go and build communication skills. You can do things like connect with other individuals who get you to other opportunities that are literally not mutually exclusive with going to college. Lots of the people who are able to take online classes get to do that and take a job where they learn those skills, which means we're getting more impacts on our side of the house. But the second thing, now we're going to talk a little bit about demand. The more online classes that become more popular, the more in demand they are, means the demand for establishing the alumni networks and extracurricular that are especially available for online students goes up, which means more people are having access to this on the comparative in the future. Remember, we're talking about the growth of online education programs. As programs and institutions develop, you have a lot of money being sent to donors and being sent to research institutes that want to be able to accommodate these students so they can make a hell of a lot more money. They frame that as an awful, profit-driven, evil corporation thing. We say it's actually a fantastic thing for the people who can actually access it. So, at this point of the debate, we've established that the vast majority of opening governments, non-unique impacts, and things they get about traditional education are going to flow to the opposition side. So now you're just going to weigh who gets more access and who has, more importantly, a better education experience while they're in school. Before that, opening.
Sure, so the obvious issue with this is that when disadvantaged people are told that they can just leave at any time, then programs in traditional colleges that, like disability services, goes down because they're told they can just get out.
Okay, but the disability services in the vast majority of traditional colleges are failing these students because they can't force professors to change their lecture styles. They can't magically change the way education works because they don't have that kind of power. So if they're going away because they weren't accommodating the students who need to go to online school to actually get that, then the impact is nil on your side, and the impacts for our side are comparatively better. So how do we solve and fix this? Opening and closing government tell you that there's shitty faculty that are coerced into developing these programs, and shitty professors don't change on our side of the house. Here's the change. When you have more people going into online schools, like I talked about, you have a lot of demand to try and meet the needs of those individual students. What that means is you get professors who are particularly trained and hired to teach at these schools to fit these adaptive learning styles. That's why there are a lot of online classes and sections specifically for students with disabilities, especially ADHD, but more things are coming into play. So the more demand you have to meet these particular needs, the more professors you have that are actually going to fix the problem, which means we get more professors that do things for students that they need on our side of the house. The second is that it is self-paced, which means you can do things like pause lessons and actually figure out what the hell a math equation is, i.e. me. Third, they're interpersonal, which means you can ask the professor a question in class without being afraid that you're going to look stupid in front of everyone else. Closing government tells us that, oh no, these algorithms are really predatory. So are traditional colleges. They go into communities. They literally came into my middle school in Homer, and Pearson Education told me how important it was for me to go to school, or I was going to be poor and die. That happens on their side of the house. They also coerce adjuncts to teach the classes that the tenured professors don't want to. The comparative advantage that closing government said was that the impact is higher and it is less temporal. Why is that? Closing government needs to explain why that's more important. Then when they talk about developing countries, again, weigh that against the rural individuals in those developing countries that literally didn't have access to the college education before, and we win the debate.
Member of the opposition for their speech, and now call upon the government whip to close off the government bench. You're here.
I think that the way Nick and I are going to win this debate is we're going to agree with a lot of what opposition says, but we're going to show you how the online educational programs use the things that opening and closing opposition tell you to mechanize them against students who are vulnerable and coerce them into paying for an education that they don't necessarily need, that doesn't value them as people. So 3 questions to contextualize this debate. First question, the top half debate. Is access enough to outweigh harms? No. Second question, which is what Robert just tries to bring in his speech, is like, is the education system fucked? And I think like, yeah, but we don't think that online is going to mitigate for the problems that they bring up, right? And then the third question, which is what Nick brings you, is like, are vulnerable people harmed by online higher education? The answer to this is yes. He gives you the most terminal impacts. We're going to win this debate on this question. So getting into the top half debate, is access enough to outweigh harms? We think that opening government does a good job weighing out like the benefits of a traditional education and why an online education you don't necessarily access these benefits. We think that they give you a really good example of like that it decreases the accessibility of a traditional education to people who might want it. And what we think is key here is that they explain to you that it de-incentivizes non-traditional people from traditional education. So how Nick comes in and really wins this debate for them is when he says, like, he shows how this disincentivization is purposefully orchestrated so that these companies can get profit, when he tells you like the mechanism for what opening government describes being the targeted algorithms, right? So then what does opening opposition say? Because I think opening opposition does the brunt of the work for this bench, right? They tell you, like in the LO, that the purpose of a university is education and specialization and access to that education. I think that Nick wins on these metrics that they give when he explains to you how the promise of access is used to exploit students, and it shows how online universities harms groups from developing their own education, which would be the best access. This is something that opening opposition actually says as well, when they say you need to grow your own teachers at home, right? What Nick tells you is how these online programs de-incentivize people from the investment in their community, because there's always another avenue for them to get that education outside of their community. He uses the example of New Delhi University in India to illustrate this, right? So then the DLO gets up here and they say, we're just going to do comparative, we're just going to run on that comparative. I'm going to give you the 3 metrics they give and show you why Nick won on them, right? First, they say accessibility. They say it's like cheaper. Nick shows you how like they purposefully use this less expensive narrative to draw in students that they know will still not be able to pay. So even though it is cheaper, we concede it's cheaper, we're not trying to say that the costs are in any way comparable. They specifically target people who still will not be able to pay those comparable costs, right? And then they say like rural communities are like better because of online education. Nick tells you like why the mechanism John describes, like of building your own teachers, is minimized, especially in developing countries who are trying to have that access to education, right? Also on like the racist old professors thing, like when there's like the white savior complex and like the conceit of the American higher education that you need that comes into play when you think about impacts outside this just the United States, when you bring it into the global south and into the whole world, right? So we think this could actually be a further harm on our side of the house. Then he tells you like opportunity, and I think on this is another thing that the member of opposition brings up, is like this whole, do you get more jobs because you're able to work while you can take your classes, right? I think that online, the people are in school and online classes because they're in a situation they don't want to be in anymore. That probably includes their work situation. They're probably working in the service sector. That experience is not respected by the companies that they would get into with these degrees. That's why you have like the for free internship program that people buy into, because they're saying like we need to have experience in the field and that's worth not being paid for. We don't think that you get any more access to that on your side of the house. We think that the jobs that people are in are still going to be delegitimized by these companies, and therefore like we don't think that you get better opportunity on opposition side of the house. Robert.
Look, the entire traditional college experience is marked by predatory loan industries and for-profit colleges that trick a bunch of kids into getting a degree that they can't pay for and that they sure don't need. Once again, we responded to this in the extension. Tell me why it is any worse or better than online college. You're pretending to be comparative, but you're not giving us the analysis as to why.
Okay, Nick and I tell you it's worse because they're specifically targeting vulnerable groups. The regular colleges are just targeting the general population to see what they can do. When you're specifically targeting vulnerable groups, that's why the harm is greater, because you're hurting people who are already disenfranchised by society, right? So on to the second question, is the education system fucked up? Yes, we think that that's basically all the closing opposition proves in their speech, right? They talk to you about this one-size-fits-all model with the lecture styles and the routine-based, and it's expensive and tests are bad, which sounds surprisingly like opening opposition first of all, but secondly, all these problems still exist in online education. You are just looped in by the idea that you can now access these problems. So you still have access to the benefits of education and an access to the bad things about education. They never tell you why in online education those things are better, right? And then basically they tell you like solvency is you get more people. The more people you get in online schools, like the better those online schools will get. What I tell you is that like this only exists if enough people buy in, and we don't think that at this point in time enough people are buying in. So at this very point in time, the harms are outweighed by the benefits. John, before time.
Yeah, so I think closing government wants us to believe that the vast majority of online schools are scam schools. I think the problem with their extension is this is actually the minority, and a lot of these online education programs are nonprofit institutions that actually have non-privileged people's interests at heart.
Most of those programs are ran by traditional universities, which I asked about in my POI, who use the profits from that to fund on-campus activities for students and don't reinvest it in making that online education better. Our opening government does a good job of telling you that, right? So now moving on to Nick's material and why he wins this debate, right? Nick wins the traditional, because he proves to you why this also harms students in traditional college education by making it more expensive because they have to compete with online education. He wins this competition point and shows the harms of reinforcing the elitism of that traditional education as well as the harms of online education in itself, right? And then Nick talks to you about targeted algorithms, right? He tells you these algorithms are predatory and seek out people who they know will get stuck in loans through advertising and targeting. Nick shows how the groups that government wants to help most, opposition wants to help most, the people who don't have access to traditional education are harmed again by online for-profit universities who put them further in debt and make their situation even worse. Then finally, Nick talks to you about academic infrastructure in the global south. He gives you terminal impacts in this debate. He tells you first that there's no incentive to develop educational systems internally, and then he tells you the two impacts of why this is negative, right? He tells you that universities are necessary for civic engagement and social justice, right? Social justice is fronted by universities and university students. It always has been, it always will be. We want developing countries to be able to do that for themselves and not have to buy into an elitist argument. Nick gives you the most terminal arguments in this debate. He shows you why on the comparative you are only harming people through online education. We think that closing government wins the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip, for their speech. Now call upon the opposition to close off this debate. Not yet.
Just gonna shake hands before Nathan.
Oh yeah, Nathan has to speak. That's right.
The present university model is not one that we've always had, right? We've had a huge variety throughout human history of models of university education on how people can become educated and adopted into various important professional positions. We think the present one is a remnant of the military college system that sought to create cogs for the Prussian war machine, right? That it has people show up on time and it has them regimented, right? They fall under a strict hierarchy, and we are proud to see it forever rest in the past.
Here.
We are not only going to say, as our opening said, that we think that online education is comparable to a in-person traditional education. Robert points out that it is in fact far better, and we are thrilled to see the death of the traditional education system, and for the following reasons. So, there's a couple things we have to answer in this debate if we're going to win. The first off is to characterize what this online education looks like with the first point. Is online education more inherently predatory than traditional forms of higher education? This is the entirety of the contribution by member government, and if it's true, it's incredibly important. But it's not fundamentally true, right? So what do we get in terms of characterizations of these online things? We think that we get three different characterizations on government benches on what colleges do in terms of this. That we get the member of government position that says that these are primarily for-profit, that this is just DeVry online, and no other form of online education exists, right? That you are just getting a Trump University degree online. These are just sort of fundamentally predatory, and these do this. In response, I would say that Robert pointed out that colleges are predatory, right? That they come into your schools, they come into your home, and they say, if you do not get a degree, you will be a failure. In addition, they also tie themselves fundamentally to the very myth that he talked about, that colleges are the only epicenters of culture, of social, of soft skills, and of education, right? That when colleges say, no, you have to live on campus. You need to pay $10,000 extra to live with a bunch of other 20-year-olds. Otherwise, you're not going to be living college right? That they say that you have to be involved, you have to be engaged, and that this community matters more than any of the communities that you are invested in, and that you can otherwise learn these skills. Your faith communities, your interpersonal communities, and your local civic communities that you are moving away from, right? We'd much rather you stay in your small town, join the small council, and commute into school on your internet than you'd rather do this otherwise. So, second off, we think that by and large, we have predatory loans, that we think that they are just as predatory, and we think that there are very harmful online universities. But whereas if your local university that's physically present is harmful to you, you have very little recourse, right? If there is an online institution, you research it, you're able to Google it because it's in a different tab, and you find out the highest quality online education, and this is really accessible to everybody, right? So we don't think fundamentally these online education is more predatory than this education, right? And we think that by and large, so let's get into this. So there's two other vitally important parts of this debate that we're going to win or lose on, right? The first is that we have to prove that we on Op Bench should prove that it's more accessible and we get greater amounts of people, right? And we think that our opening opposition does a very, very good job, that they cover an incredibly wide variety of topics on reasons why, that they think that the myriad possible reasons on why we think that this is more accessible. They talk about rural communities, they talk about this increased access, and they talk about this because recognize that the other characterizations we get out of this is that saying that this will strip away traditional resources, and we think this is good, right? That we think that this is fine. We think that the opening government is right, and we're glad to see traditional education on, and we'd like to see, because there's a finite amount of resources that these state schools have, and we'd much rather have them directed towards the online campus populations that need it more, rather than people like me who were able to live on campus for 4 years. Before this closing,
Look, if opposition wins on things like an impact cap, recognize that for every number they gain, that consequence to our harms. You're going to hire and use more affiliates, you're going to increase the algorithms, and you're going to decrease infrastructure in more communities in the global south.
okay, so we think that by and large, we prefer accessibilities over community building, right? Because we recognize that it is a function of privilege, that communities are only local, that it is bad for the citizens of New Delhi that New Delhi University is shut down. But for every other person in India who cannot commute to New Delhi, we'd rather have every single person in the global south with an internet connection, the ability to compete with the exact same degree that I, as a white guy in Anchorage, am able to compete, right? That we want to have a leveling of education. We believe that this is only possible through accessibility. So, back to the question of, is college more accessible? Because we say that, because opening government talks about how they decrease resources that we do this. We think our opening opposition has destroyed them on this point. But we think that, by and large, government still has a shot, right? That if they can say that even if more people are going to be going to college, if they can prove that online college is uniquely worse, that online college is worse than traditional education, then we think that there is a fair comparison. But we think not only is it more accessible, as proven by our opening, we believe that it is better, as conclusively proven by my closing, sorry, not at this time. So, let's talk about the one-size-fits-all model and why this is so disastrous for these schools, right? That it does not recognize the fact that there are a huge amount of neurotypicalities, that colleges by and large reward a specific model of people. It rewards extroverts that match the traditional description, right? It rewards 20-year-old college guys that are able to feel comfortable expressing in class and feel comfortable coming to these people. Not the people who need to be able to work from home, not the people who are trying to develop work experience concurrent to this, right? Not these people that are suffering either neurotypical disorders, who would struggle during a depressive episode maintaining this, that while night school is slightly more accessible, it still has fixed points in time during the day, and if you have a swing shift that's doing this, and your manager is not going to let you go, you lose out on this. This fundamentally gives you, in Robert's material, the ability to say that this is by and large better, right? So, not at this time. So, what is online education? Robert gives you 3 incredibly useful things, right? That we think that online education is adaptive. We think that they're far more likely to be able to match the specific needs of the individual when it's not a one-size-fits-all model, right? To where whenever you have a one-to-one connection, where it's you to the professor, right, and you have the email, rather than merely me talking to a classroom, much the way that I could give a better debate if I was talking to one of you individually, rather than projecting to a crowd and hoping that things sort of work, relying on the fact. So we think that it's self-paced, and this is an incredibly important part of this. So this is what we think that lets people take into their own hands, right? That we think that conventional support services that they talk about that would be going away have failed fundamentally, and we think that we should let people with their own neurotypical disorders or alternate forms of learning, we should empower them to choose courseworks and to choose programs online, which they're able to do given the accessibility of online education, that match their unique ability, that match their unique things. And we, by and large, give that this is the interpersonal, right? That we think that while it is both more anonymous, we think that it is much more able to, where you are able to specifically request feedback. That communities that don't feel comfortable going forward, right? That I feel comfortable talking during class because I'm a loudmouth white guy that thinks I'm right about everything. And I was taught to be this way. And so is John and so is Robert, right? That this is who we are. But we think that colleges, we're so much more than these people, right? We think that we need to have accessibility. We're proud of